DogWorks Radio is sponsored by Alaska Dog Works. Check out their website at alaskadogworks.com. You can support this podcast on patreon.com/firstpawmedia.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by First Paw Coffee Company, specializing in private label premium blend coffee. If you're serious about coffee, you should check it out. First Paw Coffee's passion is high-quality, small-batch roasted coffee. They take the extra time to taste and get everything perfect before they release new blends. They aim to bring you a cup of happiness each time you pour yourself some coffee. Find out more at ak.dog/free and enter for a chance to win some First Paw Coffee prizes, a book from our collection, and tote bag. One winner will be selected at random each month. That's ak.dog/free.
From First Paw Media, sponsored by First Paw Coffee Company, this is the Dog Driver Show. Visit our website at dogworksradio.com. Now here are your hosts, Robert Forto and Kourosh Partow.
Hello and welcome everybody. This is Robert and I am here with my co-host KP, and we are the Dog Driver Show. And today we are at the Great Lakes Sled Dog Association Expo in northern Michigan, and we've been here all weekend. We've been doing interviews with a lot of interesting folks, but I think our listeners are really going to be interested in our next guest. KP, who do we have?
Today we have a very special guest, Professor Heather Huson from Cornell University, great friend. I know Heather for a long time, since probably 20 almost years ago, or a little bit less, I guess, when they lived in Alaska. She lived in Alaska in Fairbanks, and we actually raced together a few times. Welcome to the show, and super excited to have you here, and tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Sure. So my name's Heather Huson, and especially for this audience related to interested in sled dog racing. So I grew up racing sled dogs. My family raced sled dogs on the East Coast, and as I got older, I just kept moving north. Eventually, I made it to Alaska to race sled dogs, and while I was in Alaska, I got my PhD, and I was very fortunate in my PhD work where I was studying the genetics of sled dogs. So I I was able to really combine two passions in one subject. So sled dogs were my subject of study, and genetics was my tool to study them. So with that, eventually though, work took me back to the East Coast, and I am a professor at Cornell University. I'm in the Department of Animal Science. My field of research is animal genetics. So with that, I study a variety of animals, everything from livestock, including cattle, sheep, and goats, to studying working dogs. So I do a variety of animals. I study really animal genetics, trying to improve their health and their performance.
A few years ago, I listened to one of your presentations in Anchorage, actually, regarding genetics and the genes related some of the performances and different conditions and items in the life of a sled dog. Tell us a little bit more about that.
So my work, what I do, is really a passion from growing up racing sled dogs, and then really applying the tools that I use now in genetics. And the main thing that I have always wanted to do is really understand what are the genetics that underlie athletic performance and adaptation in sled dogs. So that is my biggest passion. I'm still working on that. But with that, there's a lot of things that go with it. So we also look at ancestry and the relationship of dogs. So it's really interesting is, we grew up racing dogs. We had the Alaskan sled dogs, but there were also the purebred dogs, the Siberian Huskies, the Alaskan Malamutes. And then as I was racing, then it became really popular to start breeding the Eurohounds, and we were looking at these German short hair pointers. But, not only that, it was kind of throughout history, you would see the musher that would breed in the Greyhound or breed in the Border Collie or the German Shepherd, And so I was really curious from a genetic standpoint of what dogs do we actually see in Alaskan sled dogs? Like, what dogs are still there? So part of our work is really looking at what is kind of this breed composition, or what do we still see in sled dogs? And part of that is kind of this ancient stuff that we do from where sled dogs developed from. So along the evolution of Siberian Huskies and Malamutes when they were, really strictly working dogs. And that was the development of the Alaskan sled dog. But then also looking at the modern breeding, when we're breeding in these new, breeds for enhanced performance, especially speed and heat tolerance. So there's a lot of work that we do related to the ancestry, but then there's also work that we look at the performance of the performance genetics. So what influences their speed, their endurance, their work ethic, those types of things. And then the other thing we do is we look at their health. So traits that are important, such as we would commonly call it Wheezer. And so that's laryngeal collapse in sled dogs, and it's a congenital defect that the dogs have. So we look for the genes that are associated to that. So bottom line, we look for genetics of sled dogs and other working dogs.
So I was fortunate enough to be part of Heather's studies, and she has done 2 sets of genetic studies on my dogs, and she actually made a trip all the way to my kennel, taking blood samples of the dogs to research their genes, basically, regarding the items she's talking about. Tell us about this program and how you organize these taking samples, you call, and how long it takes to go and get all this information back.
Sure. So one of the most challenging things about genetics is it's not fast. Nothing we do is fast. So one of the things is, the beginning of this, as much as I want to do, we got to start with creating a foundation of knowledge. And that's where the sample collection comes in. So with that, it's, going back to the people such as yourself that, we're the mushers, and convincing you to let me go sample your dogs. And when I say sample your dogs, really what we're doing is we're collecting not only blood samples that we can extract DNA, we collect body measurements on the dogs because I'm interested in how, their body structure, their body style is also influenced by genetics and how that relates to performance. And then the other thing we collect is really what we call phenotypic data. And so phenotypic data would include those body measurements, but it also includes the mushers such as yourself when you're rating your dogs and you're giving me ratings about their ability for their work ethic, their speed, their endurance, their heat tolerance. So it's a collection of basically the DNA that I can get genotypes from, or genetic markers, as well as the phenotypes that go with that. And really what our research does is we need to learn how to associate these two things.
Heather, this is an audience that's mainly pet owners. Of course, there's a lot of dog sledding enthusiasts, but I would say by and large, most of them are pet owners. And a lot of folks today are familiar with the embark tests and that sort of thing with their dogs. And I don't know if a day goes by on Facebook or other social media where I do not see your name referenced in some part in regard to sled dogs or genetics or something. So you are very well known, at least in that world. Can you describe a little bit how accurate those types of things are? I mean, when somebody buys that on Amazon or Target or whatever, are they getting what they paid for on something like that, or is it still kind of in the real beginning stages?
That's a complicated question. Okay. So to give you some idea, these genetic tests, basically we're testing mutations that are in the genome of the dog. And that would be the same in any species we're doing. You're studying mutations that are in their genome. And you look for these mutations, which sometimes we'll say mutations, sometimes we'll say variant, and those mutations come in lots of different forms. Now, one of the most common forms that we find in our genome and that we use in these tests are called SNPs. So that's the short term. It means single nucleotide polymorphism. And what this is, it's like a one base pair change. And so, for instance, I could have the base pair of an adenine, which is just, we denote it as the letter A, and you could have the base pair of a guanine, which is the letter G. And that's a way that differentiates my genome from your genome. So all species are like this. And with that, we use those different genetic variants to test the dogs. So the way these tests, the common tests work now that are available, so there's a variety of tests for dogs that particularly they market, the ancestry. So these tests for ancestry, what they do is all of them use genetic variants. So that part is the same. What would be different is what kind of variant. So I mentioned the SNP, but there's other variants. There's like microsatellites and there's copy numbers and that you'd have to come take my genetics class for. But the test might vary in the type of variant they use. They might vary in how many of the variants they use. And with the how many variants, it also has to do with what percentage of the entire genome it covers. So tests such as Embark, they are one of, I'm not here to say this is the test everyone should get, but it's one of the tests I'm very familiar with. And so tests such as Embark, they use SNPs, and one, it's easy, it's quick, and there's a lot of them. So with that in mind, they test, so in the dogs, we test over 200,000 SNPs across the dog genome. So when you take a sample of your dog's DNA, you take a mouth swab, or I might take a blood sample, we extract DNA from those. It doesn't matter what type of sample we have, the dog's DNA is still the same. Now the quality or the quantity might be different whether I use blood or a mouth swab or a hair sample. It's still the same DNA. But then you decide what test are you going to use. So with regards to these tests, if you go to Embark, they test for 200,000 SNPs. And so every dog, and it doesn't matter if your dog's purebred or mixed breed, whatever it is, gets the same SNPs. Sometimes not all of those SNPs work for every single DNA sample or every single breed of dog or mix of dog, but most of them will work. So the different tests that are out there, there's the Embark panel, there's the Wisdom panel. Those are the top two I can think of offhand that are really common for dogs. They just vary in cost, the number of markers, and really that plays a role into the part of your question on the accuracy. So with those tests, the more markers you have, likely the more accurate the test is going to be. So something that has a lot of markers, like the 200,000, is pretty accurate. And honestly, for the dogs, that's one of the tests that has the most markers. A lot of the ancestry tests are all coming up to par. They're all coming up to a pretty high level. With that said, there are still limitations to these tests. So if your dog's purebred, for the most part, they're going to be spot on, and they're going to be able to identify your dog as purebred in that respective breed. If your dog is a cross in the first generation or second generation, they will be pretty darn spot on of what those crosses are of those main breeds. So if you have a Labradoodle and it's 50% Poodle and 50% Labrador, it's going to call it just like that. Where limitations come in is if you have, such as Alaskan sled dogs that have been a mixed breed for generations, then it gets complicated. And the test it's harder to figure out what that ancestry is. So if it's, really a mixed breed from many, many generations ago, that's going to be tough. They'll be able to give you some ideas, but it's still limited. The other limitation that comes into play is when you do these tests, so the way they work kind of behind the scenes is first you got to, again, have that foundation of knowledge. So to create ancestry, they had to have gone out and get DNA from all of those purebred dogs. So they have to have reference dogs representing all of those purebred dogs. And then you send in, say, your mixed breed dog, and it compares your dog's DNA to all of those reference dogs. And it says, how similar is your dog's genome to all of those reference dogs? Now, if you have something extremely obscure, like a very unique or rare breed, and so this would actually be more common in human ancestry, it's, a very rare, native culture that they might not have sampled. Well, if you send in your DNA, but they have never sampled someone from that population, they couldn't tell that you're of that ethnicity or a dog is of that breed. So that's a limitation on what is the reference population. If they have nothing to compare it to, it just goes to what is the closest thing to the real thing. So for instance, we have some of these Saluki crosses, and the Saluki cross that we use for this was imported from Iran. Well, the embark panel has Salukis, but primarily those Salukis are from the United States, and they're likely show dogs. So when I submitted my dog, who is this part Saluki cross, and I know she's 50% Saluki, I submitted her DNA, but it did not come back 50% Saluki. So it's not that I'm going back and going, well, the test is wrong, and I'm not going back to the breeders going, well, you're wrong. I know from the way that the genetics work that they probably don't have any Salukis from Iran in their reference panel. So it did come up Saluki, but it wasn't 50% Saluki. It was like 38, 39% Saluki. And then it kind of had this other part, and it was like super mutt. And super mutt in the embark panel is, we don't really know what it is. So those, the tests are accurate for purebreds. They're accurate for first and likely second generation. And even getting into some of those other ones, they're really good. But there are limitations. And some of it is just what's in the reference panel and what do we know about the technology right now.
Heather, we interviewed several academics like yourself, Arlie Reynolds, Rita Kemp from Finland, who are all in the scientific field behind the sport. How important is to have people like yourself doing research to improve the quality of the sled dogs, in your opinion? Do you think people like myself, like other dog drivers, they would read your researches and breed depending on what they are learning from people like yourself, like Arlie or Rita?
I think some will. Some will see the value in it. Some of it, the technology and the commercialization and availability stuff, it's got to catch up and make it possible for you to use it. And so the more that we do shows like this, where I can explain it, are going to help. Because, I love the field of genetics, but I'll be the first one to admit, you say genetics to a lot of people and they're like, oh my God, like, what is that? Genes, okay. And I mean, it's really intimidating. So it's something that I find really challenging, and the more we can get out there and just explain it and put it in terms of like, yes, I can do all the nerdy science behind it, and I love my nerdy science, but with that said, if we can explain it into how can you use it, that's what makes it important.
So you think we can create this super dog if we follow your rules and your research?
So I think it will give you a tool to help you create dogs, your super dog, more quickly and more accurately. So it's really funny because I grew up racing sled dogs, and then I did this hiatus working in livestock genetics. And, it was really funny because I had to learn about cows and cattle breeds and sheep and all this stuff. And I compared everything to what I knew about dogs. And now I'm going to give you an example of using cattle. So one of my greatest ambitions is to be able to do genetic selection with sled dogs. So with working dogs, but that includes sled dogs. So what this means is basically I'm at the point of doing all of the foundational research. So I need to figure out what genes control speed, what genes control endurance, what controls heat tolerance, what controls diseases that are relevant to sled dogs. So that's where I'm at right now. But once you find out that information and you have those markers that are associated with all of those traits, you can use that to select and breed your animals. You can use that to help you identify how to train your animals, how to manage your animals. So while this might sound kind of like pie in the sky, this is used all the time in dairy cattle, internationally. We know traits about their production, about their health, and about their conformation. And we can use all of that, we can test their DNA, and we can tell you this is that animal's genetic potential. So we know that it has a potential to produce this much milk. It is less or more susceptible to mastitis. and it will be roughly this tall. So that's kind of the concept. And that's what I want to do with working dogs. And so dairy cattle breeders use this all the time. You know, minimally, they are going to select the sires for their cows on this all the time. That is how AI companies market their bulls. The farmers that use this even more extensively genotype all the cows on their farm, and they decide who to cull, who to breed, how to breed them, and which calves to keep, how to raise them, all kinds of stuff. So there's tons of potential. So even though it might sound like a pie in the sky for sled dogs and working dogs, it is very much possible. We just got to keep working on the research to get there. And a lot of research is going on. It's going on. I work in sled dogs. We're working in detection dogs. We're working in guide dogs. And so numbers is a big deal. Being able to get more and more numbers of dogs within breed is a big deal. Across breed is a big deal. So there's lots of things that make it complicated, but interesting. So yes, it's possible. We're getting there.
It's so fascinating to listen to her. We are fortunate to have people like Heather, like Korea. We talked to her a few weeks ago about sled dogs, and I believe it's going to push our sport to a scientific level where we can go faster and be stronger. Definitely.
Yep. Heather, as I mentioned in my first batch of questions, your name comes up a lot on Facebook groups, sled dog groups, etc. And I'm sure they're really interested in hearing. And you may have just mentioned it. What's on the new horizon? What's right over the hill in terms of sled dog research in your field? Mm-hmm. What can you share that people that have heard your talks before in the sled dog world that may not know right now today?
Sure. So I think, as far as I know, I'm probably one of the only ones that's still doing genetics on sled dogs. But with that said, in my own lab, we're doing work on laryngeal collapse in the sled dog. So the goal there is to really come up with a test. So similar to some of my early work that helped go into the test for Alaskan Husky encephalopathy. That's a mouthful. But there is a genetic test for that, and that is our goal for Weezer. So granted, Weezers are rare among sled dog communities nowadays, but still, if it's in your kennel, it's a big deal. So that's one of the things we're working on. I'm still working on this genetic selection and athletic performance and that stuff, so that's a big deal in my lab. But the other thing that takes up a huge amount of my time and is really interesting right now is we're working on aging. So we're looking at basically the aging of canines as a big picture. Sled dogs are our model. So about 3 years ago, we basically went out to dog mushers and said, would you donate your dog to our study? And with the donation of the dogs came to Cornell. They live at Cornell, so we have 100 dogs. They live out their lives at Cornell. They have their own kennels. They have kennel mates. They go out for playtime. But the overall goal with this is to really study their aging and their aging process. And when we do that, it's not just genetics. I work with a number of colleagues that are fantastic, colleagues that are at Cornell, as well as the VICA Foundation, who is the main funder of this project. But then we have colleagues at Roswell Cancer Institute, obviously interested in disease and cancers. We have colleagues down at North Carolina, at Penn State. And really, as we study aging, we're studying it from all different viewpoints. So my background in sled dogs, I lead the physical conditioning. Everyone knows as we get older, our physical abilities are going to decline. So we monitor how the dog's physical abilities decline by running them on a treadmill or having them pull, basically weight pull, or a cart with some weight on it. Now, it's not extreme exercises. We don't want to, completely exhaust the dogs. We just want to see how they change over time. My colleague, John Loftus, he studies immunology. So he studies how their immune response changes and inflammation as they age. We also study the genetics, how their genetics change. We study their cognitive behavior. So really, cognitive dysfunction is the equivalent to Alzheimer's in sled dogs, and we're studying how aging affects that. So we study aging from a variety of viewpoints.
Very interesting stuff. Heather, one last question. It's the question I ask all of our guests on the show, and I'm interested in your perspective from your research. And that is, if a person is just getting involved in the sport and they're coming to you for a piece of advice, and maybe they're coming for advice on the dog that they should get, what would you tell them from everything you've just mentioned and all of your knowledge as a musher and everything else?
So I absolutely love dogs, but I can't imagine not having a dog. And so I realize how important that is to people. And I think it's really important to get the right dog. So regardless of how much I use genetics or that I race dogs, I would not tell you to do a genetic test immediately to figure out what dog to get. I would not tell you to get a sled dog. Figure out which dog fits you and your personality. And there's lots of information on the web available for, do you live in an apartment? Do you live, in the country? How, active are you going to be with your dog? What kind of dog do you like? Do you like a clingy dog or do you like an independent dog? So that's really what I would say is see which dog fits you. Don't necessarily just go with that one's cute.
Yeah, and then you can tailor a sport to it.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
it could be a sled dog sport for a lot of dogs.
There are a lot of options.
Or bike joy or whatever. Heather, that's all I have. KP?
Heather, thank you so much for being part of the show. It's always a pleasure listening to you and also working with you. You're more than welcome to stop by anytime, sample my dogs, and create the super dogs, okay?
I'm working on it.
Very good. On behalf of our guest today and my co-host, this is Robert from the Dog Driver Show here on our last night at the Sled Dog Symposium in Michigan. We'll talk to you guys next time. Goodbye.
This episode of the podcast is sponsored by First Paw Coffee Company. Learn more at firstpaw.coffee.
From First Paw Media, this is the Dog Driver Show. We hope you enjoyed this podcast, and we invite you to subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You'll find a link on the episode notes. You can tap or swipe on the episode cover art, and you can see some offers from our sponsors. You can support our show by supporting them. If you like what you have heard, we would love it if you could give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends how to subscribe too. Your hosts are Robert Forto and Kourosh Partow. Our producer is Robert Forto and created for First Paw Media. Did you know that Alaska Dog Works trains service dogs for those in need throughout North America? Each and every service dog that is trained through the Lead Dog Service Dog Program and Michelle Forto and her team has an individual training plan. We train for autistic, mobility, psychiatric, and PTSD for our soldiers for service work. If you know of someone that may need a service dog, please take a moment and check out Alaska Dog Works on social media and at alaskadogworks.com.